All right, good evening. Tonight in your video notes, we are going to be covering two sections in your book, chapter 4.1 and 4.2. So there's some hefty notes that we need to cover tonight. So what we're going to cover is how factors can contribute to global climate and how can competition shape communities and interact with different populations. So first, we're going to begin with weather versus climate. So what is the difference between the two? So you probably have heard this in your previous science courses, especially in 8th grade, but weather is our day-to-day conditions and other environmental factors that we talk about that are day-to-day. So today the weather is going to be 59 degrees outside and it's going to be a little cloudy. That is an example of weather. And climate is referring to an average condition over a long period of time. So when we talk about climate or climate change, when you hear those kinds of words out in the media, we're talking about very long periods of time, patterns that exist that are yearly or annually or have a pattern that is longer than just day by day. Okay, so we're going to talk about some factors that influence climate. And so you've heard about greenhouse gases before. So greenhouse gases has to do with this kind of layer on the above in our atmosphere that's kind of has some methane, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and so it's like this layer in our atmosphere. And what happens is light can get through, light can enter and get to our plants and get to all of the bacteria that go through photosynthesis and things like that. But what happens is the heat gets trapped in, and then that's what helps keep our atmosphere somewhat warm. And however, there's been an increase in the greenhouse gas layer over time, and so more heat is getting trapped. And that's when you hear some information in social media about climate change and whether things are changing with climate and their temperature. All right, some other factors include latitude and solar energy. So we kind of remember this from, again, 8th grade or even elementary school. The Earth is tilted such a way, and where the sunlight directly hits certain spots in certain points in time can depend on how much the temperature would be. And so, for example, tropical regions, it gets more direct sunlight, and because it gets more direct sunlight, you actually have most of the biodiversity, and we'll talk about that in our next unit. Then another factor that influences climate is, of course, wind and ocean. So temperature fluctuates, and so that determines the wind currents that happen and then the ocean currents that happen in the water. All of that is results from the heating and cooling of our atmosphere. Okay, so that was all chapter 4.1. Quick, now we're going to move on to chapter 4.2. Which is talking about how organisms are interacting with their environment and with others. So we're going to talk about this word niche. What is a niche? I want you to put down that a niche is a range of physical and biological conditions where species live and obtain food to be able to survive and reproduce. So that's a very, very long definition, very, very long. And so what I kind of want you to remember a niche is what's the organism's role in the environment? What's its job in the environment? And how does it play a role in the environment? So think of it as a job, an occupation, and kind of what an organism needs to do and how it's a unique organism to that environment and how can it help others around it in its community. Okay, so habitat. Habitat is a place where the organisms live. It's usually a general place in the ecosystem, but then yet specific to where they live in the environment. And so there is this word called tolerance. And so an organism can only tolerate a certain range of conditions. So something that lives in the desert can't tolerate going to a rainforest. So when we talk about tolerance, we're talking about the ability to survive and reproduce under a certain range of circumstances and conditions. And so if the organism begins to experience stress, it is going outside of that optimum range. And so we kind of, if you see here, we use this bell curve to show an optimal range at the top point. That's kind of the optimal range of what the organism can tolerate in its habitat. And then if it goes out, it'll decrease population. And if it goes on the other side, it'll also decrease population. So remember, homeostasis is to maintain internal constant environment. And so the more energy they need to maintain homeostasis, the more stressed out they can be. So they have to be in their optimum range. All right, so competition. Competition is when organisms need to attempt to get resources, and they need to compete for those resources in the same place at the same time. So sometimes an example would be forest plants are competing for the same amount of water and the same amount of light that they are getting. So there are two types of competition. There's intra and inter. Intra, think of it as an A. There's an A in intra, so think of A as same. Same species are competing, so both black bears are competing for the same resources. But then think of inter. Inter-specific competition is when you have different species. So inter has an E in it. Different has two E's in it. So try to remember those two going together, that they are two different species that live in the same area, but they are competing for similar resources: food, water, space, that kind of thing. So when we talk about competition and how it shapes communities, we're talking about if resources are not limited, there's going to be a bunch of food and shelter and water and mates, and so the population is just going to grow and live and be the best it can be. However, when you have competition, specifically an intra, where you have two species that are, or one species competing for the same situation, you might see the population decrease. For example, if there's not enough food, then the same species, those, like I said, those black bears will be fighting for food, fighting for mates, and you might see a little population decrease. Okay, so predator and prey relationships. This is also talking about competition. So predator, remember, is what goes and tries to find stuff to eat, and prey is what's being captured. And so if you have an increase in predators, you're going to see a decrease in the prey. If you have an increase in the prey, you're going to see a decrease in the, or you're going to see an increase in the predators, because there's more food for them to try and get. Same thing with herbivory. So we saw a predator-prey relationship. There's going to be a herbivory and plant relationship. Herbivores are eating plants, and so if you have a lot of herbivores, you might decrease the plant population. If you have a lot of plant populations, you might increase the herbivore population. So there is this relationship and how they interact with each other, and the size, both are dependent on each other. All right, so keystone species. Keystone species is a very important concept, and these types of species really impact whole communities. And so a keystone species is where there's a change in a population of a single species can dramatically change the structure of the community. So if something happens to that keystone species, the whole community can be impacted and affected. And so I'm going to talk about the sea otter, the sea urchin, and the kelp tomorrow in class. All right, so we are going to stop at keystone species, and we are going to continue with this process of symbiosis on a later date. So we're going to pause here in our notes, and please make sure that you have a question or two on the left side to come back with any questions you have, and we will see you tomorrow.